In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. When my dad was a teenager, he bought a 1947 Mercury, which even in those days was an old car. And he bought it cheap, and it looked like a cheap old car. It looked like a wreck. Its body was covered with rust and dents and dings, and I know this because I found a picture of it one day in an old photo album. And there was the car, and there was my dad as a young man. I could barely recognize him. And then there were all his buddies around him looking real tough. They had their hair slicked back, and they had cigarettes, and they were leaning on the hood. I thought it was the most fantastic picture I'd ever seen. So I took the picture to my dad, and I said, "Hey, Dad, what's this?" And he looked at the picture, and he laughed. And then he began to point out his friends, and he was telling me the names of his buddies. He said, "There's Stan, and there's Lou, and there's Mike, and there's Job." I said, "Joe? No, not Joe. Job. J-O-B. "Well, which one's Job?" I said. "The car," he said. "I named my car Job." "Why did you name your car Job?" I said. He said, "Look at it. It's a wreck." "I named my car Job," he said, "because that poor car knew much suffering." My dad chose the Old Testament name of Job for his afflicted automobile because Job is the Old Testament symbol of suffering. The book of Job is about a man who suffers, but it's not just a story about a man who suffers. The book of Job is an ancient Jewish meditation on suffering and why it is that people must suffer, and especially why it is that innocent people must suffer. Why bad things happen to good people. It's an ancient book that asks a modern question. People today look at the world and all its suffering, and they ask, why all that suffering? But people have always looked at the world and all its suffering and asked, why all that suffering? Why any suffering? The modern question is an ancient question. It's a universal question. Virtually everyone who has ever lived and looked at the world has asked that question. Which is why the Jewish story about a man who suffers is not about a Jewish man. Nobody in the Jewish story is Jewish, which makes this Old Testament story pretty unique in the Old Testament. Job is not a Jewish man, but he's not, on the other hand, treated as if he's a Gentile, as if suffering is some Gentile problem. Job is represented simply as a human being. And he is represented as a righteous man who does right by his family and does right by his neighbors and who does right by God. And he suffers horribly, miserably, and inexplicably. He loses all his money, and then he loses all his property, and then he loses all his family, and then he loses his health. His body is wrecked. His whole life is wrecked. And he doesn't know why. And he wants to know why. Traditionally, Job is praised for his great patience, so that when we see somebody today who's being incredibly patient, we will say, hey, that person's got the patience of Job. But in the story, Job is not represented as patient. The story represents him as furiously impatient. He wants his suffering to end now. The only thing he wants more immediately than the end of the suffering is he wants an explanation from God. Why am I suffering? Tell me now. And that is not counted against him as a sin in the story. Okay, it's actually represented as an expression of Job's faith. It's a questioning faith. It's an impatient faith. It's even an angry faith, but it is faith. Job believes in God, and he believes in God enough to believe that God will pay heed to the person who questions him. Why must I suffer? Why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? Religion, Jewish, Christian, and most of all the others, have traditionally given answers to that question. One of the answers to that question religion gives us is that there is suffering in this world because we deserve it. There is suffering in the world because we've sinned. We suffer because we sin. Okay, the first thing to say about that answer to the question is that that is a horrible thing to say to anybody who is suffering. The second thing to say about that answer is that it's sometimes true. When I was a teenager, and then later when I was a young man, I made a lot of bad decisions, and I did a lot of damage, and I hurt a lot of people, including myself, and I suffered for it. And my father, who loved me, would regularly, frequently, take me aside and say, "Do you see what you're doing? Do you see what you're doing to yourself? Do you see how you're suffering? You are suffering because you're making bad decisions." Okay, I needed to be told that. It was good of him to tell me that. He told me that because he loved me. Eventually, I heard him. But none of that answers Job's question. Job is not asking why irresponsible and sinful young men like me should suffer for our bad decisions. He's actually asking, why should my dad, who never did me wrong, suffer the consequences of my bad decisions? I mean, in that sense, Job represents my dad, a righteous man and an innocent man who suffered much through no fault of his own. And he represents all the other people in the world who have suffered things they don't deserve. The biblical witness is that there is suffering which is not deserved. And there's a lot of it. The book of Job is asking why. In the story, just like that old Kodachrome of my dad's car, Job is surrounded by his buddies who have come to comfort him. And these buddies comfort him by leaning on him. I mean, his friends comfort him the way, unfortunately, we sometimes comfort our suffering friends. They comfort him by giving him a whole bunch of free advice. So, they say, "You know why you're suffering, Job? You're suffering because you keep complaining about God. If you stopped complaining about God, you wouldn't suffer." To which Job replies, "I am complaining about God because I'm suffering." "Well, you wouldn't be suffering," his friends keep telling him, "if you would just make your peace with God." To which Job replies, "I should make my peace with God. He should make his peace with me. I don't deserve this." To which his friends say, "Obviously, you do deserve this. You have done something to deserve this. If you didn't deserve this, this would not be happening." To which Job replies, "I want God to tell me what I did to deserve this, because I know I am innocent." The book of Job is a long book. Most of it, the bulk of it, is dialogues between Job and his friends who keep leaning on him. And Job, throughout the book, protests his innocence, and throughout the book, his friends keep telling him he's guilty. While the one person Job is waiting to hear from remains silent. The song we chanted this morning is not from the book of Job, but I think Psalm 22 captures the experience of Job. The experience of intense physical suffering and intense spiritual desolation, and crying out to God and not getting an answer. That's a part of the Jewish experience. And that is a part of the Christian experience. Because that's a part of the universal experience. At the end of the book of Job, God finally speaks. And in the end, God does not answer Job's question. He never gives Job an explanation. The first thing God does at the end of the book of Job is he rebukes Job's buddies for giving Job all those explanations. You can't explain suffering, he tells Job's buddies, by blaming the victim. As a matter of fact, you guys can't explain suffering at all. The world is not a piece of mechanical engineering in which every input automatically produces a predictable outcome. Life isn't like that. Some human decisions have logical, predictable, and observable results, but not all of them. Maybe not even many of them. Not every tragedy can be traced back to somebody's sin. Job is not suffering because he sinned, God tells his buddies. He doesn't deserve this. He's innocent. And then God turns to the innocent man and rebukes him. Not for questioning him, not for being impatient, not even for being angry. God rebukes Job for an expectation Job has, which is actually not very different from the expectation of all his buddies. His buddies believe that suffering is the automatic consequence of sin. Job believes that happiness is the automatic consequence of righteousness. Job believes that righteousness is an insurance policy against suffering. I am a God who keeps his promises, God tells Job, but I never promised you that. I never promised you there would be no suffering. And having said that, God heals Job, takes away his suffering, and restores him to happiness. Now, the moral of that story is not that suffering is a good learning experience, though it sometimes is. The moral of that story is not that suffering builds character, though it sometimes does. The moral of that story is not that suffering draws us close to God, though it can and it should. Okay, those are all good morals. But those are morals you have to find somewhere else in the Bible. Okay, the moral of the book of Job, if you want to call it a moral, is that suffering doesn't always immediately produce morals like that. Because, the book of Job says, suffering is a mystery. And it has a meaning. But the meaning is sometimes, and probably often, beyond our knowing. The book of Job doesn't say everything that can be said about suffering. It just warns us against saying more about suffering than we know, especially to people who are suffering. One commentator sums up the book of Job by saying, Job is crying out to God, I can't understand this. And God replies by saying, I know. You can't understand this. There's something about suffering that Joe can't understand, and his friends can't understand, and we can't understand, that God alone knows. But God understands what we know about suffering. We don't know everything he knows about it, but he knows everything we know about it. Because God himself has chosen to enter into the universal human experience of suffering. And he chose to do it as a righteous man and as an innocent man who suffered intense physical pain and intense spiritual desolation, and who was surrounded by people he counted as his friends, who instead of comforting him, accused him and called him blameworthy. And then they wrecked his body. And then on the cross, God himself recited the psalm we chanted this morning. Okay, we do not worship a God who lives somewhere up in heaven, sitting in the lotus position, contemplating the mysteries of life. But we worship a compassionate God who, as the second lesson said this morning, sympathizes with us in our weakness and empathizes with us in our suffering, because he suffers with us and for us. That's his reply to Job and to everyone else who has ever suffered. He suffers for us and with us. And not just for the righteous, and not just for the innocent, but also for the guilty, like me, who visited suffering on other people who didn't deserve it. He suffers with and for the guilty, as well as the innocent. Whether or not our suffering draws us close to God, our suffering has drawn him close to us. However randomly or senselessly or meaninglessly our suffering has come upon us, it is no longer meaningless if God himself is sharing it. And he is. That's his answer to us. His answer to us is compassion. That doesn't take away our suffering. And it doesn't take away the mystery. And it doesn't give an explanation. All it does is it gives us a promise. Whatever we suffer, whyever we suffer, God is suffering with us and for us. And what God suffers, God redeems.